Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about a very small process that is extremely important called the stretch shortening cycle, how that contributes to our performance, how to train it, and what it has to do with sprints, because we're always trying to get faster, right? Ready, Hector? He hasn't looked at me all day since I stole his leg. If you paid attention in anatomy and physiology, you know in the human body we have structure and function. So the structure is going to be like the bones. We have the tibia and the fibula, and then we have this cool little mini band to represent the primary movers, the musculature, the tendons. So this represents like the peroneal tendons that run here along the outside of the leg. We would have the Achilles tendon back here. We'd have the gastroc and soleus on the back. Those are the muscles. Tendons, good to go. Now we consider the SSC most commonly when we're jumping because then it's most obvious, especially repeated jumps, but it's also present when we're sprinting, especially at top speed where we're spending very little time on the ground and we want to come off the ground faster. And those are high speed, high amplitude SSC bouts. So that means we're moving under 250 milliseconds, extremely fast process. But we also need to take it into account when we're doing things like walking or even doing a jerk on a clean and jerk. When we do that little dipping motion, we're still taking advantage of it, of the SSC, but it's extremely low amplitude and low velocity. It's gonna be anything over 250 milliseconds and slower. The SSC also occurs in the upper body. So for example, baseball players, pitchers, that happens in the shoulder. It's the exact same thing. So keep that in mind as we're talking about that with the example of the lower leg. Let's define the SSC in itself. This is a three-phase process, and each process has its own individual things that are really important, so we're gonna break it down. This cycle is pretty overcomplicated because, again, as I usually have to say, we don't know that much about it, but what we do know is actually not that complicated. The SSC for me really signifies like the ultimate balance between tension and relaxation in high performance in the human body, and it's amazing because literally the SSC is the requirement of an active stretch and then an immediate shortening of the muscle. So a very strategic tension and then a strategic relaxation to set you up for the next bout because again, it's cyclical. This is gonna sound a lot like talking about muscle contraction, but don't get it confused because the phases are a little bit different. So phase one is the eccentric phase, which requires a lengthening of the primary movers. So these being our primary movers here, how am I gonna lengthen them? Well, I guess I could do something with my knee up here, but it's not a likely story. It's gonna have a lot to do with my ankle or my heel. So I'm gonna push it down and I'm gonna put tension on this mini band, my primary movers. Now they're loaded. And because they're loaded, now we have energy in here. So this is like acting like a spring, okay? The second phase we have is amortization. My foot is completely flat on the ground. This thing is loaded. And now I'm looking at an energy transfer where I'm going to spring out of this and propel myself out, where I no longer have such high tension on these primary movers. The eccentric phase, I've got it lengthened. I've either dropped down or I'm landing and I've loaded my spring essentially. I've got the recoil or the amortization, and this is the energy transfer that's happening on the ground against the ground. And this is the ground contact time, of course. So the longer time you're gonna spend on the ground, the less elastic you are. It's gonna turn immediately muscular. Again, we wanna take advantage of the power and the energy that's in these tendons. In order to get these movers, again, to relax, they have to shorten. And so my heel is gonna have to come up again. And that's me pushing off against the ground, whether that's a jump, whether that's a sprint, whether I'm walking. First of all, let's talk about how this even works. Well, the body has a reflex system, and we're not gonna dive all the way into that because that's neuroscience and I love that. So to keep me from getting carried away, we're gonna do the short version. You have like an elbow reflex and you have a knee reflex. If you hit it in the right spot, it's gonna jerk. Well, this is essentially the same thing. And it's like your body takes a shortcut up just to the nervous system, like to your spinal cord, not all the way up to your brain, which takes a little longer for it to actually be a quick reflex without ever having to think about it, whether we've consciously thought about it or not. So a reflex is just something that hits your spinal cord and the spinal cord sends a response. The signal doesn't even make it all the way up to the brain before the body has responded. There's a couple of other things at play as well, like things to do with fascia and muscle spindles, and I'm going to avoid that part of the discussion so we can get into heel stiffness, but there are a lot of really great videos on explaining the SSC and how it works in depth, so go look up one of those. So how this relates to sprinting. Again, we're thinking about this like a coil of energy. So in order to be elastic, I gotta load these suckers up and I gotta explode at the right moment. It can't be with too much weight, it can't be from too high of a distance, because then it's going to become muscular, and anything that's muscular is not elastic, and anything that's muscular is also going to require us to bring a lot more time on the ground. For example, the difference between acceleration and top speed in sprinting. So to take a more practical example, let's have a look at the counter movement jump versus a static or squat jump and see how those two add up performance-wise and how the SSC really does contribute to performance. Although the stretch shortening cycle can happen with actually all of our limbs when we make contact with the ground or something similar, a really classic example of this, probably the most simple to understand, is the counter movement jump. I'm gonna put my hands on my hips just to make things easier to see. A counter movement is gonna be this dip, the lengthening phase of the stretch shortening cycle. Then we reach amortization, and then shortening, where we're taking off, I'm exploding, that's the concentric phase. This is easy to see in the CMJ because we actually have the counter movement, and there's actually a huge difference in performance almost every single time. I've never met somebody who can jump equally without counter movement and with counter movement. So a counter movement jump without my arms, again, is gonna look something like this with the dip. And then without counter movement, we're gonna actually start in that dip position and then try to jump out of this. So again, we're not even getting that first phase, we're not getting the eccentric, and all we're doing is shortening when we're coming up. Pretty big difference. Again, I'm gonna do it with the counter movement, even under a little fatigue here. Another example of this is doing it in the drop jump variation. And here you're gonna be able to see pretty clearly when I go through each of the three phases and move back up into the vertical jump. Let's get back to Hector's leg and talking about sprinting, which is what we came here for. Now remember when I said that anything that is muscular is not going to be elastic. Acceleration is primarily muscular. In acceleration, we need to be strong in order to push ourselves away from the ground, which then leads to spending more time on the ground, so a higher ground contact time, which means this amortization phase is a little bit longer, and we're not getting that elastic effect yet. But as we transition into top speed, our ground contact time is definitely reducing. However, we have a dilemma that we also need a stiff ankle. We don't want to run just on our toes because we're not actually using the full range. We're not using all the possibilities of the energy. And we're also looking at hamstring issues because we're towing and pulling and just working on our toes, which is a huge load to the hamstring and completely unnecessary. It's also not very economical to run like that, so you're also getting gassed. As we are approaching top speed or have arrived there, we are going to load this tendon in preparation. What's important here is that we have an appropriate level of ankle stiffness. If I have too stiff of an ankle, I'm not gonna be able to move my foot at any point during this. So I'm not going to be able to absorb or generate with any efficiency. Not to mention that it's a major injury waiting to happen. If I don't have enough ankle stiffness, that's also an injury waiting to happen. I'm gonna spend a ton of time on the ground because the force has pushed me down and I can't recover from it fast enough. I don't have any stiffness here to help me absorb. Now in maximal speed, we're usually landing with the foot in front of the hip, not by a ton. We're obviously not towing out and pulling back. However, there is going to be some pulling motion, so as we approach the ground, we have this tension. We have also an appropriate amount of ankle stiffness. Again, we touch the ground. This is loaded. Still, we reach amortization as the foot is underneath and cycling through. And then as we get into this position again, we're pushing off, we relax, the foot then is not so stiff, and we pull the leg back through to again start the motion. Fatigue also plays a role. What's interesting about SSC fatigue is that they found when this is required in a game or in a training session, for example, over and over and over again, that fatigue actually stays in the body for longer than the muscle pain afterwards. So even after a match, if you're sore the next day, your SSC hasn't fully recovered, so your nervous system hasn't fully recovered, even though you're not sore anymore. Obviously, with load, there also has to be recovery, so it's always something I like to bring in there and mention. Now, how can we train this? Because it's critical that we train the SSC, yes, but also, again, that ankle stiffness for each activity. Like, how can we know how stiff our ankle needs to be? How do we not decelerate on every step, give in or be too flexible or be too stiff and then cause ourselves an injury? How do we regulate that? I'm so glad you asked. I'm here to answer exactly this question. Sorry, that was bad. Some of my favorite exercises for this, of course, are plyometrics. We're going to practice with what we already have. Depth jumps from a height, but not too high, because again, we don't want to turn it muscular. We really want to practice this elasticity, explosivity. Repeated ankle jumps or pogo jumps, where they're just coming out of the lower leg. Single leg jumps that require ankle stiffness, but then also relaxation, so side to side or forward and backward. And of course, maximum velocity sprinting. I think that's the best thing ever. There's also ways to train these primary movers for ankle stiffness, such as single leg or floating heel squats, calf raises, tibialis work, Obviously, the lower leg is going to be extremely critical for most sports, such as soccer, football. We really want to keep this healthy, so invest in that. And also don't forget that the SCC is power. So fatigue is going to play a huge role because it's coming from your nervous system. So even though we're talking about repeated plyometrics, please don't do 1,000,000 reps of high intensity plyometrics because that won't help anyone, and it will put a ton of fatigue on your nervous system that will stay until even after you're not sore anymore. I hope that video was helpful. I'm gonna give Hector his leg back so he'll stop ignoring me now. I hope you have a great day. Bye.